Hey everybody, this is Dr. Maples. Welcome back to our Social Change in Appalachia lecture series. We're going to continue our conversation about the West Virginia mine wars today, but we're going to do so in a non-sequential fashion. There's a couple of things that have been happening in the background that I haven't mentioned yet because I wanted you to understand those core ideas like the Matewan massacre separately from some of the background noise. Now, today is going to all be about that background noise. First off, we're going to spend the time wrapping up this battle for the Tug and understanding some of the power dynamics that are happening in that region. Second, we're going to talk about the Yellow Dog contract, something that was actually happening even pre-Cabin Creek, Paint Creek, and something that's been going on for a long time that shapes the ability for workers to unionize or not unionize based on laws. We got a lot to talk about today, so what do you say we get started? One can imagine, after the Matewan massacre, the state of West Virginia is getting a little freaked out. What can we do to control the powder keg that we're sitting on in Mingo County, where violence, murder is becoming a normal way to handle things? There's some historical precedent for what the state's done in the past. We go back to Paint and Cabin Creek. You'll remember that Governor Glasscock sends in the state militia. The state militia disarms both the union miners and the coal operators and the Baldwin Felts and basically kind of keeps the peace under martial law. It doesn't work perfectly. They have to declare martial law 3 different times, and even then people are still getting murdered. But at least by disarming everyone, things kind of get a little better. In this situation, the governor does something a little different. New governor, new times, new tactics, right? They send in the state police. Well, they send in the state police, but it's not exactly the state police. It's a volunteer army version of the state police. People who volunteer to come in and basically keep the peace in Mingo County. And I get the sense that this was a lot of people who were volunteering because they were against the union. In fact, what ends up happening is 800 state police from West Virginia come to Mingo, and they form something called the Mingo Militia. Now, the sheriff of Mingo County is like, no, you are not letting these people in. This is my county. I have control. And the state basically said, tough, we're doing this. And these 800 volunteer state police, Mingo militia, whatever we may want to call them, come in, and instead of, say, disarming people or trying to keep the peace, they actually become allies with the coal operators. This is really starting to break up the power dynamic in the very once pro-union stronghold that is Bloody Mingo County. Now, you'll remember from our last video that in January of 1920, the UMWA announced, hey, we're going to unionize the Tug Fork area. Now, the Tug Fork is a tributary of the Big Sandy, and it forms a big part of the Kentucky-West Virginia border, and that's actually where we're going to be for a big chunk of what comes to be called the Battle of the Tug. Now, the Battle of the Tug officially gets started June 14th, 1920. It's when the Mingo Militia attacks several tent colonies of striking miners in the Matewan area. This includes both sides of the borders, too. Now, we finally got Kentucky really involved. We got Merrimac, West Virginia as one of the areas that was attacked, as well as McCarr, Kentucky. Now, this is interesting because it concerns really bootlegging. It wasn't necessarily the striking miners that was the thing. There was a big, strong belief, and honestly, the evidence proves that it was accurate, that people in the Union camps were creating moonshine. This was at a time, too, that they could sell that and make money where they weren't getting any other funds in and maybe not getting enough support financially from the union to make ends meet for all these people. So they come in, they break up all the stills, they shoot people, they shoot lots of rounds into tents and stuff like that. One person ends up being killed. They destroy camps, they destroy the supplies as well, so they create a starvation situation for the summer and winter for these people. Now, it's really tragic because in this situation, both locations in Merrimac and McCarr, there's stories of the families of the miners basically having to hide out, in one case in the mine itself, and in another they hide out in a company store. And actually, in the company store case, there was an interesting case of someone actually being born during one of these conflicts. They were putting up mattresses along the sides of the walls to try and keep the bullets out. To what degree that actually would work, I'm not sure. But nonetheless, it was a really interesting and sad story of how this person came into the world. The true fatalities of this, though, are not known. We have the people who are wounded by the bullets and who are murdered by those bullets. But we also are in a situation that we don't know how many people starved to death. Simply put, with the supplies, the tents, the shelter, everything being destroyed, and these folks being in a very remote area where they don't have access to other supplies short of hunting, it's a really dangerous situation. And that's one of the shadows of the mine wars, is that one of the groups that really paid for this in blood was the families of these miners, who in many cases faced starvation. It's kind of a sad postscript to this event. But it would actually be a year later before the Battle of the Tug really would wrap itself up. Skirmishes go on for about a year, and it's not until March 1921 when the new state governor of West Virginia chooses to get involved again. In this particular case, he declares martial law, but he also puts a specific person in charge. That's Major Tom Davis. Now, Tom Davis is not someone that we have mentioned to date, but he did fight against the Union at Paint and Cabin Creek, so we could probably guess what his sentiment was going into this. Now, Major Davis puts a couple of fine points on this martial proclamation. First off, he bans anyone from entering the mining camps, except for the people that live there. Now, why would he do this? Well, the whole idea is to keep people from bringing in supplies and reinforcements, right? If we limit it to the people who are already there, then that means the Union is not technically allowed to bring in more supplies. People who are sympathetic to the miners can't come in and bring supplies. I mean, they can't even drop off food because they would be violating that martial order. He also bans all assemblies in the area. Well, union assemblies. I mean, churches are still able to meet. Parades probably happen. Heck, any other assembly is fine, except for the union assemblies. In fact, if you're in a union assembly, you can assume two things. A, it's going to get broken up with violence, and B, you're going to go get arrested. And what's going to happen when you get arrested? Well, point 3 was that the major basically decided he would be the judge, jury, and executioner as part of the martial courts. That's right. You would go before Major Davis, and he was the one who would decide your fate. We can imagine how this really changes things. It does start a process of stabilization, I guess, but at the same time, we also still see murders happening every couple of days. So even as stability is happening, we're also seeing a lot of violence being brought down onto the mining community. Now, we could expect at some point the unionized miners are going to lash out and fight back, and they do, May 12th through 14th of 1921. There we see the Union miners leaving their camps armed and attacking non-Union camps in the area, often from afar, shooting them with rifles. Now, they do this in Matewan and in Williamson, which aren't too terribly far apart, and it also kind of gets both sides again of that Kentucky-West Virginia border involved in the situation along the Tug Fork. I don't know that miners could have predicted the reaction to this, however. I don't know if this attack was out of desperation or out of need for supplies, but what ends up happening is an overwhelming response against the miners. We see the non-union miners starting to fire back. We also see the Mingo Militia getting involved. We see local sheriff deputies get involved. And get this, the Kentucky National Guard gets involved. We now see a lot of guns pointed right back at these Union miners fighting against their cause. Now, these attacks only result in 3 deaths. There were likely many more injuries, and there may have been more fatalities that we don't know about. But this creates a situation that matters a little later in this year when we start to get to Blair Mountain. This is where Governor Morgan from West Virginia goes in and requests federal troops. Now, this is a big one because by requesting federal troops, you're taking things from the state level and saying, hey, I can't handle this at the state level, and putting it on the national government and saying, I need help from you to put this issue down. This is big. Now, federal troops were declined in this situation, but it sets a precedent. In fact, not too far into the future, we're going to see more requests for federal troops, and it's going to go a little differently. In the meantime, a truce ends up being signed between the two sides, officially ending the Battle of the Tug. And in this situation, we have to say that we see on many fronts a union that's probably demoralized because this conflict has not inherently gone the way that they would have hoped it was. There's also some other things happening in the background too that are shaping this arrangement that's going to make it even harder both now and in the future for unions to get a foothold in the Tug Fork area. And that's the Yellow Dog contract. Now, the Yellow Dog contract is basically a contract that coal operators will make their workers sign that essentially say, while I'm here, I agree this is an open, non-union shop, and I'm not going to attempt or participate in efforts to unionize this shop. And if I do, I can be fired and sent out of the area. That's the essence of the Yellow Dog contract. And it actually had been around for quite a while. We saw these even in the early 1900s being used pre-Paint Creek, Cabin Creek. The whole purpose here, though, was to ban union activity in places like Mingo that were so fervent in support of the Union. Now, after the Matewan massacre, the Red Jacket coal mine ends up using this. Remember, Red Jacket's only about 2.5 miles from Matewan. It's right in that immediate area. And they start taking up the use of the Yellow Dog contract. And through a really weird twist of legal events that is outlined in Bloodletting in Appalachia, and I'll let you read about it there, we actually see that the Yellow Dog contract is legitimized for a period of time. It basically creates a situation starting in 1917 where unionization is banned. People basically, once they sign a contract, they're not able to turn around and start trying to support the existence of a union there. And then later on, mines begin using these contracts and violations of these contracts as a way to get injunctions against the union. And that basically says if the union now comes in and tries to unionize this shop, it's a criminal offense. They're basically trespassing and coming in and breaking these contracts. This ends up being a wildly successful way to further etch away at the support for the Union in places like the Tug Fork area. In fact, this ends up being spread to the New River Gorge, another big mining area that we don't cover as part of the West Virginia Mine Wars, but was also an area that was very anti-union, with only one exception, and that being the small town of Elverton, which I wrote a paper about this one, but they self-unionized. It's kind of a cool side story. I'll put a link to that paper in the description below. This ends up being something, though, that is, first off, used to limit the power of the unions, but it also becomes something where 50,000 plus miners and their families are forcibly evicted because of violating their contracts. And this is a situation, yet again, where we see those mass evictions into tent colonies, the tents being attacked, starvation. You see where we're going with this. The Yellow Dog contract is just one of those things happening in the background amid the McDowell murders, the Matewan massacre, and so forth that is continuing to weaken the Union's power in the region. In fact, some could argue they're even getting to a point that they're really desperate for a very big win to happen. Otherwise, things are going to go south here. I have to imagine the deaths of Sid Hatfield and Ed Chambers in McDowell County later in 1921, as covered in our previous video, were a demoralizing thing from the UMWA. But I want to do this sidestep on history so that you understand they were losing ground even before that. Things were really starting to chip away at them. And then there's another piece that's happening that we're going to cover in our next video, and that's Logan County, who ends up becoming a pro-coal stronghold that is legendary in the study of West Virginia coal history. There, Don Chafin was creating his own empire, and that empire ran deep. It included basically hiring and firing the sheriffs that would be supportive of his cause, pushing the Baldwin Felts out so that he would have full control over his own mine guards. And even in a situation, he would, control who could and could not be hired into positions even like teaching. It was one of those weird situations where all the perfect storms were coming together that a very rabidly anti-union person was able to seize power in Logan County and to make it a stronghold. And in fact, well, if the UMWA was looking for a big win, this was probably somebody that they were going to have to deal with and deal with soon. It was a frightening situation, and this leaves us right at the gates of Blair Mountain. And I'm going to leave it there. Thanks for watching this channel. Subscribe if you haven't already. Please share this with your friends. I'd love to see your comments below. I'll see you next time.